Where are you right now? What time is it where you are? Maybe it's evening. Maybe you're lying down looking for something quiet to sink into. Something slow and strange. Something that gently untangles your mind while the rest of the world folds itself into the night. Let's go to an island. It's not a famous one, not a sunny tourist spot. Just a speck on the sea in a time that no one talks about anymore. It's called Flatey, a small island off the western coast of Iceland, lost in the cold grey of the 17th century. You wouldn't want to be there. Not really. But tonight we're only visiting, quietly. The loneliest place in the world, Flatey, was always remote. No one accidentally landed there. It was flat, cold, and shaped like a fallen leaf drifting in the sea. Even the name meant Flat Island. Just a few dozen people lived there, mostly fishing families. There were no roads, no trees, not even proper wells. People drank rainwater when they could, and when they couldn't, they drank brackish, mineral-choked runoff. But they had something else. They had a manuscript. Not just any manuscript. The Flateyjarbók, or Book of Flatey, a massive medieval Icelandic compendium of sagas, kings, and Norse myths. It was kept in a locked chest in a priest's house, guarded not with weapons, but with silence. The islanders rarely read it. Most couldn't. It was written in an older form of Old Norse, one that only clergy and scholars could decipher. Still, it was their treasure, their ghost. But this isn't a story about a book. Not really. It's a story about forgetting daily life repeated to death. In the early 1600s, Flatey was a loop. Every morning, gather fish, repair nets, patch shoes, burn driftwood, try not to die. Repeat. They didn't write letters. Didn't record births unless a priest happened to pass through, which was rare. They rarely traded. Most people on the mainland couldn't even remember who lived there. And slowly, the people of Flatey began to forget themselves. How? Because routine erodes memory. Days melted together like candle wax. Children weren't taught history, only survival. And as the old died, they took stories with them. One winter, a traveling bishop named Brynjolfur came to the island. He noted in his diary, "They have no songs, no remembrance of fathers, only fish and wind." The collapse of skill over time, this forgetting wasn't just about memory, it was about skill. Midwives forgot the proper herbs. Blacksmiths forgot how to quench iron properly. One family forgot how to preserve cod and caused a rot that wiped out an entire winter's stockpile. The islanders began doing things not because they knew how, but because someone else once did. A kind of historical imitation. They mimicked the ghosts of knowledge without understanding the thing itself, like children mimicking prayer, mouthing sounds they never learned to mean. And this is where the real horror begins. Not war, not plague, but a kind of slow social rot, like forgetting how to eat or how to mourn. A priest with too many questions in 1651, a new priest arrived. Jon Gissurson, young, ambitious, obsessed with the preservation of Icelandic history. He had heard of the manuscript, the Flateyjarbók, and believed it might contain key genealogies lost to the mainland. When he arrived, he found more than a book. He found a population of 41 people, and not one of them could tell him the name of their great-grandparents. Not one could recite a saga. The oldest woman on the island, said to be over 80, couldn't remember her own mother's name. John was disturbed. In his private notes, later published posthumously, he wrote, "They live as if they have no past. They eat, sleep, and fish. No tales, no customs. They keep no holidays. I have never seen Christians more godless." He held sermons, tried to teach them old hymns, but no one sang. They stared back at him, blank and tired. And still, the wind howled across the flat land. And the fish didn't bite. When the sea turned away that same winter, something changed. The sea stopped giving. It's not clear why, but catch after catch came up empty. Nets tangled, boats capsized. The driftwood dried up, and the wind snapped the roof from the chapel. John recorded a dream he had during this time. I walked into the church and found it full of water. The pews were floating. The altar was gone, and the manuscript had turned to salt. Dreams, nothing more. But in the weeks that followed, people began leaving the island. Not all at once, but one by one, in quiet silence. They didn't say goodbye, didn't pack much. Some took boats and never returned. Others simply disappeared into the snow. By the end of winter, only 7 people remained. John, his assistant, and 5 islanders. The emptying of Flatey. Eventually, John sent a letter. To the bishopric, he wrote, "The people have not died, they have vanished. And those who remain know nothing. It is like living among the sleepwalking. I fear I will become like them." He begged to be recalled. He was granted permission, but by the time the ship came, only 3 people were still alive. John left. He took the Flateyjarbok with him. It was eventually transferred to the Royal Library in Copenhagen, where it remains to this day. Flatey was left empty, and for 20 years, no one lived there. What does it mean to forget? This wasn't a massacre, not a plague, not a rebellion. It was something worse in its own quiet way, a social unraveling, the end of continuity. Today, Flatey is inhabited again. A small seasonal population, a few guest houses, some birds, but in the records of Icelandic history, there's a gap, a hollow place where lives once were. It raises a strange question. What happens when people forget not just their history, but the very act of living? What happens when memory is no longer passed down, and only repetition remains? You're still here, and so is the island. The sea is quieter now, but the wind still hasn't stopped. It's always blowing somewhere in the North Atlantic, through lichen-stained walls over crumbled cottages, past collapsed turf roofs and across shorelines where the bones of old boats rot slowly into driftwood. The people of Flatey vanished long ago, but they left something behind. Let's go back. Not to the moment they disappeared, but to the decades after, when the island became empty, when the story nearly ended, and when one man decided it shouldn't. The last man to return in 1676, a merchant named Olafur Eiríksson, arrived at Flatey with a shipment of dry cod, old wool, and enough salt to last 2 winters. He expected to find a waiting population of buyers. Instead, he found silence, not silence like a church, silence like a place that had forgotten how to echo. The houses were still there, most of them, doors hanging open, tools rusting in dirt. One cottage still had a kettle with a thin layer of soot under it, as if someone had cooked there only weeks. But that was impossible. No one had lived here in over 20 years. Olafur didn't leave, not right away. He stayed the night, then 2, then longer. He wrote later in his account, "I cannot say what held me. Perhaps it was the emptiness. The land was not cursed. It simply waited." Cataloguing the forgotten Olafur was not a historian, but he had a habit of writing things down. He began keeping a daily record of what he found on the island. A broken crucifix with a name carved into the back, Sigrid. A sealed jar of pickled fish, still intact. a pair of boots stitched together with human hair. He made maps, not of the terrain, but of the memories. On his crude sketches, he labeled cottages with names he found on scraps of parchment, on bits of wood, or whispered in local folklore from nearby islands. Here lived the one who couldn't speak. Here lived the man who prayed to the sea. Here lived the girl who sang once, but no one could confirm these names. The mainlanders had forgotten Flaty. Its people were gone. Even their stories had rotted away like forgotten apples in the snow. Still, Olafur stayed, trying to remember a place that forgot itself by his second month. Olafur had turned one of the abandoned homes into a small library. Nothing formal. Just shelves made from old boat planks, filled with bits of recovered writing, fragments of Bibles, scribbled measurements, fishing tallies, and unsent letters. The letters were the strangest. Many had no recipient. Some were just a single sentence. I am tired of fish. Please remember me. Did we used to sing more? Most were unsigned. Olafur didn't try to analyze them. He copied them down carefully. He believed, quietly, stubbornly, that memory mattered, even if no one asked for it. He wrote, "These words are like driftwood. No one knows who carved them, but they were carved." The disease of repetition. One theory that emerged years later from later studies of Flaty's collapse was this: cultural amnesia syndrome, a concept proposed by a 20th century Icelandic anthropologist. The idea is simple, that in isolated communities, when the number of people drops below a critical point, function can remain while meaning disappears. Children still learn to fish, but don't know why certain rituals matter. They remember the action, but not the origin. Over time, culture becomes mimicry, religion becomes habit, and finally, life becomes unbearable, not because it is painful, but because it is empty, and so people fade, not from disease, not from famine, but from the quiet breakdown of meaning. A question no one asked: did they leave, enter, or forget to return? Olafur spent 6 months on Flaty. He never found any graves from the vanished years, just one badly dug pit near the shore, half collapsed and filled with bones, not human but seal. There were no memorial stones, no evidence of a mass death, no sign of fire or violence, only the whisper of departure. What if, he wondered, they hadn't died? What if they had left, not for somewhere else, but away from something? What if forgetting wasn't an accident? What if it was survival? The church with no Bible. In the center of the island stood the old church. It had been stripped of its ornaments long ago, but the altar was still intact, a slab of driftwood, carved with runes too faded to read. Inside, Olafur found a single artifact, a wooden box with iron fittings. Inside it, nothing. It had once held the Flaty Jarbok. He knew the manuscript was now in Copenhagen, but the box, the empty container, seemed more meaningful now than the text itself, because the book was gone. The stories had left, and only. The silence remained to be honored. He left a note inside the box: "You once held memory, that is enough." An island that waits without expectation. By the 18th century, Flaty was repopulated, first by sheep herders, then fishermen, later seasonal dwellers. It never fully came back to life, not like it once had. It became a stopping point, a half place, a location rather than a home. No descendants of the original 41 have ever been traced. There are theories, of course, that they fled to the mainland under assumed names, that a storm wrecked a supply boat and marooned them, that John the priest was lying, and something darker happened, but no evidence supports any of these, just blank pages. empty cottages, and the cold, when nothingness becomes legacy Olafur. Eventually left Flaty and died years later in Reykjavik. His writings were never published in his lifetime, but they survived. A young historian named Arna Valdís published them in 1906 under the title Notes from the Island That Forgot Itself. In it she asks, what do we owe to the forgotten dead? If not memory, then at least attention. She noted how Flaty wasn't special in its geography, wasn't exceptional in its resources. But what happened there, the gentle, invisible, unraveling of a culture, was perhaps the most dangerous kind of tragedy. Because it doesn't feel like a story, it feels like nothing, and nothing is harder to mourn. And unresolved questions. Here we are, one island, one manuscript, 41 vanished people, and a silence that has lasted longer than their names. Maybe Flaty is unique, or maybe there are 1,000 forgotten. Flaties across the world, places where meaning leaked out of the soil and was never replaced. Places where people didn't die. They simply stopped being remembered. So we end this section with a question not about them, but about us. What stories are we forgetting to tell, simply because they seem too small to matter? Are you lying down now, listening in the dark? The sound of your breathing is probably the loudest thing in the room. Now imagine a whole island where that's all there ever was. Not war, not grief, not shouting, not even music. Just the sound of people breathing, quietly, routinely, until they didn't anymore. This is the final part of Flaty's story. We've followed the unraveling, the forgetfulness, the slow collapse of memory and meaning. But now let's ask something else. What survives? Not the people, not the rituals, maybe not even the names, but still something remains, something softer, something stranger. Let's go deeper. The philosophy of losing culture. When anthropologists discuss cultural extinction, they usually talk about languages, dialects that disappear when the last speaker dies. But Flaty's loss wasn't linguistic. It was philosophical. Imagine knowing how to fish, but forgetting why you pray before you cast your net. Imagine marking the equinox, but not knowing what it's for. Imagine growing barley because you always did, but forgetting that your ancestors believed it made the gods weep when harvested too soon. Culture isn't just practice, it's the why behind the practice, and when the why vanishes, all you have left is empty gestures. That's what Flaty became, an island of gestures. The return of Jon the priest. You remember Jon Gisserson, the priest who tried to bring memory back to the island in 1651. Decades after leaving, when he was old and nearly blind, Jon wrote a strange letter to his successor in Reykjavik. It was never sent, discovered in his effects after his death. He wrote, "I fear I judged them too harshly. They did not forget. Out of laziness. They were not godless, they were tired. Imagine holding water in your hands, but how long before it slips through the cracks? That was their memory. It was not lost. It simply could not be held anymore." He ends the letter with a confession. "I dream sometimes that I never left, that I stayed, that I forgot too. And in the dream I am not afraid. I am at peace." What does that mean? Was forgetting a tragedy or a kind of mercy? Theories from the modern day. Let's shift forward in time. In 1983, a team of Icelandic university researchers conducted a microhistorical study of Flaty's depopulation. They reviewed surviving letters, examined soil samples, and conducted audio interviews with the descendants of 18th century settlers. They came away with three conclusions. There was no single cause, no epidemic, no mass migration, no natural disaster. The oral tradition collapsed faster than literacy could replace it. Once meaning disappeared, survival itself became unbearable. A former anthropology student wrote, "We always imagined people die because of external forces. But what if culture itself is the scaffolding that holds people up? Remove that, and even food and shelter aren't enough. When ritual dies before the body..." Let's pause here and go very quiet for a moment. Think of the smallest things you do every day. Boiling water for tea, knocking twice on the table before sitting, washing your hands a certain way, humming a tune your grandmother hummed. Now imagine doing all of that and forgetting why. It would feel small at first, just a little emptiness, a little dullness in the gesture. But what if no one remembered? What if no one taught the meaning again? The ritual would die, then the stories, then the joy. Not all at once, but grain by grain until even mourning feels like a foreign thing. That's what happened on Flaty. They stopped burying their dead with songs, stopped naming storms, stopped marking births with bread and honey. Not because they didn't care, because they didn't know. A small candle in the Royal Library today, the Flaty Jarbok rests in a temperature-controlled chamber in the Arni Magnusson Institute in Iceland. It was returned from Denmark in the 1970s after long negotiations. It is one of the largest medieval Icelandic manuscripts in existence, filled with tales of kings, seers, ghosts, and voyages. But if you ask the curators, they'll tell you the truth. No one knows who on Flaty first saved the book. No one knows who last opened it before it left the island. No one remembers the last hand that touched its cover before it was locked in. That wooden box. The manuscript remains. But the hands are gone. A quiet victory. Or a haunting reminder. What does it mean to preserve memory without life? There's a kind of melancholy that comes with historical preservation. You can save every object, record every date, and still lose the meaning. You can write a name on a gravestone day, but not the laugh, the voice, the way someone stirred soup. Flaty shows us the edge of what history can and can't do. It can preserve the shells of culture, but not the spirit. You can read the sagas, but you can't hear how someone on Flaty once whispered them to a child while the wind rattled the windows. Memory lives in the body, not just the page, and when the bodies vanish, sometimes the meaning does too. The island today, Flaty, is beautiful. Really. Birds nest on the rooftops. Wildflowers bloom between the flagstones. The sea is still grey but soft. Tourists visit in summer. Some even bring books and sit quietly near the old church ruins. There's a small plaque near the site where the library once stood. It reads, "Here, the wind remembers." It's poetic, but incomplete. The wind does not remember. You do, by listening, by wondering, and maybe by imagining lives so ordinary, so repetitive, that they vanished without a sound, yet still mattered. A final reflection. This is not a story of warning, nor of failure. It's a story of silence, of how a place can forget itself, not through malice or disaster, but through the simple erosion of attention. It's a reminder that not all losses come with fire. Some come like snow, soft, cold, and impossible to notice until it's everywhere. So, tonight, as you lie in your bed, as your thoughts slow down, as the dark deepens and the world grows still, ask yourself, what quiet rituals in your life are keeping memory alive? And would anyone notice if they were gone? What time is it for you? Are the lights off? Is the air still good? Stay like that. Now close your eyes, not all the way, just in your mind, and imagine a plain of dry earth. cracked, colorless. No trees, no grass, no birds. Just dust and the echo of steps that have long since faded. This is where it happened. A village you've never heard of. A place with no statues, no monuments, no survivors. Its name doesn't appear on most maps. But if you trace your finger across the lower Carpathians in central Romania, just before the slope dips into wheat country, you might feel a soft indentation in the land. They called it Cergo Mic, and one year they prayed for rain, and got ice instead. The drought that shouldn't have been it was the year 1786. The mountains had barely shed their winter snow. Villagers in Cergo Mic expected the thaw, expected the streams to rush, the ground to soak, the barley to root. But none of that happened. The snow melted too fast. It rolled off the slopes like oil on glass, never sinking in. The ground, still frostbitten from the hardest winter in decades, rejected it. Water ran over the earth instead of into it, and then disappeared. Within 2 weeks, the soil cracked. By the end of March, not a single bud had bloomed. The elders muttered about omens. The priest held mass every evening, and the sky stayed dry. A village built on routine Cergo Mic was not a special place. It had 43 homes, 2 wells, 1 windmill that almost never worked, and a chapel smaller than a barn. People herded sheep, grew barley, and tried not to be noticed by the tax collectors in Alba Iulia. The village had no noble families, no garrison, no school, but it had rhythm. Every Tuesday was bread baking. Every Friday was well cleaning. Every 4th Sunday was confession. And every solstice they prayed for rain. It wasn't a ritual made for droughts, just tradition. A gathering, a soft song, a procession to the edge of the fields where they would scatter barley flour and say, "Rain for the living, not for the dead." But this year, it felt different. This year, people believed it. When the priest stopped preaching, Father Jacob had been the priest of Cergo Mic for almost 30 years. He had the kind of hands that looked like tree bark, and a voice that barely rose above a whisper. He'd buried more villagers than he could remember, and baptized only a handful. He believed in quiet persistence. That God helped those who didn't demand too much. But the drought unsettled him. His sermons grew stranger. He stopped referencing scripture and started talking about memories, about how rain was like forgiveness, soft, unearned, and most likely to fall when you stopped asking. People listened. Some wept. And still, the sky refused to open, the ritual that went too far. By June, desperation had taken hold. The village organized. A second procession. Not a celebration, but a penance. They walked barefoot, carried buckets of dry soil on their heads, covered their mouths with ash. They believed they had offended something. Not necessarily God, but perhaps the land itself. A chronicler from a nearby parish passed through and wrote, "They punish themselves not because they are guilty, but because it is the only power they have left." For 3 days they walked in circles around their fields. On the 4th the cold came, the storm in reverse. No one expected ice, not in June, not after months of sunburnt soil, but the clouds rolled in with a dull yellow tint. The wind dropped suddenly, and with it came hail, not large but endless, then frost, then silence. The next morning the temperature was 1 degree above freezing, and it stayed that way for 10 days. No sun, no rain, just a cold mist that wrapped itself around the bones of the village like mourning cloth. The animals began to die first, then the elderly, and through it all the villagers kept praying for rain, not understanding that this was the rain, just wrong. A decision without discussion, they. had one last gathering, midsummer. Not a ritual, not a prayer, just a meeting in the chapel. Some argued it was punishment, others said it was a mistake. The priest, pale, sunken-eyed and trembling, finally spoke. "We must remain still. We must wait for the rain to remember us." And so they did. They stopped hunting, stopped working the land, stopped gathering wood. They waited in silence, in hunger, for rain that would never come, an ending with no witnesses. By August, the village had no heat, no food, and no firewood. They had the will to pray, but not the strength to walk to the fields anymore. The chronicler who had passed through earlier returned in October. He found empty houses, half-frozen sheep in the chapel, a loaf of mold-ridden bread still on an altar. In the largest home, he found 13 bodies, seated in prayer formation, hands clasped, frozen upright. The well was full, but no one had drawn water. Why didn't they leave? It's the question historians always ask. Why didn't they abandon the village? The region wasn't under siege. There were no bandits, no walls. They could have walked 10 kilometers and found food, fire, and warmth. But they didn't. Some theorize that religious devotion rooted them in place. Others believe they were following orders, real or imagined, from the priest. One theory suggests they fell into ritual paralysis, a form of psychological rigidity where the act of doing what you've always done overrides the logic of survival. But the simplest explanation, they believed the rain would come because it always had, until it didn't. A quiet place on the map today. If you travel to that stretch of Romanian foothills, you'll find nothing. No ruins, no markers. Sârgu Mic was swallowed by time and soil. Its name survives only in an 18th century land census and a half-page note in a regional church register. But occasionally, during drought years, farmers report odd patches of soil where nothing grows. A kind of cold, dead zone. No birds, no worms, just dust and stillness, and a strange urge to stop moving. And so we end this section with a thought Sârgu. Mike didn't die of war, didn't die of disease. It died of waiting, of belief, of trusting that the sky would eventually do what it always had, and when it didn't, they waited longer. So ask yourself as you drift off, what would it take for you to stop moving and just wait for a salvation that never arrives? Still lying back, still listening? Let's return now, not to the village itself, but to everything around it, because what happened in Sârgu Mic was never reported as a disaster. No urgent dispatches, no state decree, not even a formal burial, iti. Simply wasn't noticed. And that's where this part of the story begins, not with what the villagers did, but what everyone else didn't do. What happens when people vanish and no one remembers they were ever there? The cartographer's blank in the summer of 1787, a royal cartographer named János Lukács rode through Transylvania. He was updating the Austrian Empire's land survey, part of a slow, methodical project to categorize every useful inch of terrain. When he reached the valley where Sârgu Mic had once stood, he noted something strange. There were indications of human presence, flattened grass, overgrown paths, the remains of fencing. But no sound, no smoke, no people. In his logbook he wrote, "There may once have been a village here. It is now unsuitable for cultivation. Soil thin, light frost still detectable at night." He sketched a rough outline of where he believed buildings once stood, but he left the space unnamed, a blank. The ministry that never asked Austrian records from that year lists several small settlements, abandoned or depopulated, due to land exhaustion and peasant migration. But Turgo Mick isn't named in any of them. Why? Possibly because no one declared it missing. No taxes were due from Turgo Mick that year. No complaints were filed. No neighboring towns reported refugees. In the eyes of the state, it didn't fail. It simply never reappeared. Modern historians believe the village may have been considered invisible, too small to be its own parish, too poor to matter economically, too isolated to raise alarms. So it wasn't erased. It was never written down properly to begin with. The chroniclers regret. We return now to the only man who left a first-hand account of the village's final days, the unnamed chronicler from Alba Iulia. His second visit, the one where he found the bodies, was not officially sanctioned. He had gone out of morbid curiosity and possibly guilt. He later wrote, "I had passed through, I had seen their faces, heard their prayers, and when they begged me for weather signs, I told them nothing. What could I have said? That the world does not answer, that rain cannot be summoned." His writing was private, never published during his life, but his journal survived. In the margin of one page, a single line is scratched again and again, almost as if he was carving it into the paper. "They died because no one told them to stop." Frozen in the middle of ritual, we often assume that starvation leads to desperation, that people will do anything to survive. But the case of Turgo Mick challenges that idea. When the chronicler entered the chapel, he found food. Not much. A few bags of blackened barley, jars of pickled turnips. Enough to last days, maybe even weeks. So why had they stopped eating? His own words, "I believe they had decided to become part of the prayer, that the fasting became the sacrifice." This is not uncommon in history. We have records of processions becoming vigils, vigils becoming mass starvation, not through punishment, but through belief. A belief that surrendering entirely might be what moves heaven, weather as a judge. There's something unsettling about how natural the tragedy was. It didn't require a plague, or a tyrant, or a war, just a pause in the rhythm of the world. We don't often think of weather as political, but in the 18th century, a single misplaced frost could shape lives more deeply than any law. The people of Turgo Mick understood that. They believed the sky wasn't indifferent, only slow. That, if they proved themselves worthy, the weather would return to their favor. What they didn't understand was this: the weather doesn't notice. Echoes in nearby villages in 1790, a census taker reported hearing strange stories in nearby towns. One farmer in Obarshire claimed that when the wind blew from the east, it carried the smell of bread and wax from a village that no longer existed. Others claimed to have seen ghost processions, barefoot figures walking toward invisible fields, holding empty pails. But when questioned more closely, these stories faded. They were dreams, misrememberings, or maybe the villagers needed a way to talk about their own fear, the fear that waiting too long for salvation might trap them, too. The rise of the waiting cults, in a strange postscript to this story, the early 1800s saw a small rise in rural waiting movements, groups that practiced extended fasting, isolation, or cyclical rituals designed to bring balance to weather and land. Some were peaceful, others dissolved quietly. A few ended in tragedy. Turgo Mick was never cited by name, but scholars believe it may have seeded an idea in the regional psyche, that withdrawal from the world might be the purest form of belief. The danger, of course, is this: what if the world doesn't come back for you, when no one comes looking? There's a recurring theme in forgotten tragedies, not the violence of their fall, but the silence after. No rescue, no scandal, no national mourning. Just a pause, a shrug, a skipped line. In a registry, Sergomik is that kind of story. They died. No one came. And the fields were eventually ploughed by someone else who didn't even know a village had once stood there. The deepest horror in history is not what we remember, but what we never realize we forgot. So we end with this thought: when the sky changes and the ground stays dry, we all look up. We beg, we wait, we pray. But what happens when no one outside your village even knows you're waiting? What happens when forgetting isn't an accident, it's a default? What happens when survival is simply not witnessed? That's how we end this section. Still, with me, close your eyes for a moment. Picture a village that no longer exists, not burned, not drowned, not torn apart by war or plague, just erased, slowly, softly, as if it were made of fog and someone exhaled too hard. This is how Sergomik ends. Not with a scream, but with a long, flat silence. In this section, we look not just at how the village disappeared, but how the world decided to forget it. Not out of cruelty, but because forgetting is easier when the memory was never very loud to begin with. The chapel that didn't crumble. Let's return to that chapel, the one where the chronicler found 13 villagers frozen in place. It is years that followed. Shepherds passing through the region reported that the building, though abandoned, never seemed to collapse. Its wooden walls, unpainted and untreated, held firm. The door, always slightly ajar, swung open in the wind, but never broke. Even after storms, the roof stayed on. Local folklore claimed it was because the last prayer had never been finished, that the building was holding its breath. Of course, this was just a story, but it reveals something else, a strange reverence even from outsiders for a place where belief outlived survival. The grave that wasn't. Dug, most disappearances end. In discovery, a body, a note, a gravestone, but Sergomik left none. The chronicler, too shaken to carry out burials himself, lit a fire in the chapel hearth, not to warm, but to signal. He hoped someone from the neighboring village would see the smoke and come investigate. No one came. The bodies were left there, seated, folded, still. When he returned months later, they were gone. Not buried, not looted, just gone. He assumed wolves or weather had scattered them, but no bones were found, no footprints, only the chapel, still standing, still waiting. When the archive fails, let's talk about record keeping. In 18th century Transylvania, rural archives were sparse. Births were noted only if the priest was literate. Deaths were sometimes estimated. Census records rounded numbers. And if a village was too small, it might be listed under the name of a nearby settlement. This means that when a place like Sergomik disappeared, there was no official record to remove. It simply fell off the edge of the page. An archivist named Elisabetta Neucker once said, "If a person dies and no one records it, they still leave bones. But if a village dies and no one writes its name, even the ghosts forget how to find it." Soil that tells a story. In 1997, a team of geographers conducted core soil samples across the Transylvanian plateau. In one particular sample, they found a 3-inch layer of unusually pale, silty soil, rich in human carbon compounds, but low in organic growth. It matched no known settlements, but the layer coincided with the period between 1786 and 1788. They labeled the anomaly isolated anthropogenic event, Semic region. It was the only trace of Sergomak in modern scientific literature. A ghost in the dirt, a whispered memory in sediment, a visitor who brought silence in 1801, an itinerant. Monk named Brother Caspar passed through the region. He spent one night near the chapel ruins and wrote the following in his journal. There is no village, but I felt I had trespassed. The air was not empty. It was full of unfinished prayers. He left a cross carved into the bark of a nearby tree, but again, no grave, no shrine, only passing marks, signs that someone once paused, then moved on. The lessons. No one took, so what do we take from this? Did Sergomak teach anyone anything? There were no royal reforms, no ecclesiastical declarations, no shifts in agricultural policy, no literature born of its demise. The empire continued, the churches moved on, the fields were absorbed by larger landholders. It was a disappearance without consequence, except maybe this. In a few small prayer communities across rural Romania, there is still, into this day, a tradition of never fasting more than 7 days during drought season. No one remembers why. No one remembers when it started, but the rule remains. Sometimes, even when memory dies, its shadow lingers, the modern silence. Visit the area now and you'll find a meadow, flat, green, and unremarkable. But if you stop walking for long enough, you'll notice something. No birds sing there, no bees hum, and the grass bends at a strange angle even when there's no wind. Local hikers say it's a place where compasses flutter briefly, like they're unsure. Children are told not to camp. There, not out of fear, but because you'll come back different. No one says haunted, they say. Too quiet. As if the ground itself remembers how still everything became and doesn't want it disturbed. What is a death with no witness? We often talk about tragedy as something that demands our attention, but Chergomik was not a spectacle. It didn't rage. It didn't cry out. It simply vanished, sustained by belief, undone by silence, buried by bureaucracy. And yet, it feels more human than most disasters, because its people didn't give up. They didn't rebel, they didn't curse the sky, they just waited until their hope outlasted their bodies. A final reflection tonight as the world grows quieter around. As you feel the weight of your blanket, the softness of your pillow, the steadiness of your breath, think of them. Not because they were famous, not because they changed history, but because they didn't. They were ordinary people caught in a season that turned against them, who chose belief when they could have fled, who held each other in silence until there was nothing left to hold. They were forgotten. But for a moment just now you remembered them, and that is enough. Before we begin, what time is it where you are? Late, probably. Maybe the room is dim. Maybe you're waiting for your thoughts to slow. Maybe the silence around you feels deeper than usual. Perfect. Now imagine this, a town covered in soot, but with no fire. Place where people kept sweeping their streets clean, even as the air itself turned to ash. This is the story of Döllersheim, a town in Lower Austria that burned nothing, yet smoldered until it was gone. No war, no plague, no riot, just a slow erasure, not of buildings but of memory, identity, and purpose. Let's begin. The town that no one could find on a map, Döllersheim, was never large. Tucked into the Waldviertel region, a misty corner of northwestern Austria, it had less than 500 residents for most of its existence. It wasn't strategically important. It wasn't wealthy, but it was old, centuries old. The town was first mentioned in a document from 1143. in the middle of the Holy Roman Empire's tangle of feudal disputes. It had a parish church, a blacksmith, and a pattern of slow, seasonal life. People there lived quietly, died quietly, and were buried under lichen-covered stones. So why, by the 20th century, had it disappeared completely? Why does no one live there today? And why do old German maps list the region not as abandoned, but as cleansed? Ancestry as a curse. Let's start with a single person. In 1931, a genealogist researching the paternal lineage of an obscure politician named Adolf Hitler found something strange. His father's birth certificate listed his birthplace as Strones, a hamlet under the administrative district of Döllersheim. The genealogist was alarmed, not because of anything scandalous, but because the ancestry was uncertain. The grandfather's identity was ambiguous, and whispered rumors swirled about illegitimacy, servants, and Jewish ancestry. The report was buried, but not forgotten. In the years that followed, Hitler's regime quietly began drawing attention away from the region. Archival records were edited, clerical documents misplaced, cemeteries left untended, and Döllersheim, sleepy, harmless, ancient Döllersheim, began to dim. A town marked for forgetting in 1938, shortly after the Anschluss, when Nazi Germany annexed Austria, Döllersheim was strategically repurposed. The military announced that the town and its surrounding countryside would be used to create a new Wehrmacht training ground, one of the largest in Central Europe. Over 40 villages were evacuated. Thousands were displaced, but Döllersheim was treated differently. While most villages were simply absorbed, Döllersheim was deliberately depopulated. Its church bells were removed, its cemetery was dug up, its archives were moved to Vienna and never returned. No official statement explained why, but whispers circulated that someone somewhere wanted this village and everything it remembered to be gone. The fire you can't see it was during these years that locals began to use the phrase, "They burn the shadow, not the house." What did that mean? It meant that Döllersheim wasn't destroyed by bombs. It wasn't looted or flattened, its home still stood. Its walls didn't fall. But the soul of the place, the records, the stories, the names, were systematically erased. Weddings unregistered, graves unmarked, photos confiscated. It was as if someone had taken a torch to the idea of Döllersheim, not its wood and stone, but its memory. And then they left, when the wind carries dust. Instead of ash after the war, the Soviets briefly controlled the region. Then it returned to the Austrian government. Some suggested resettling the town. Others petitioned to restore the church, but the government declined. They claimed the soil was contaminated with training debris, that it would cost too much to clear, that the place had no real historical value. By the 1950s, only a few buildings remained standing, moss-covered, roofless, windows gaping like open mouths. One man who returned to visit his childhood home found a tree growing through the middle of his old kitchen. No plaque, no marker, no path. He wrote, "I felt like I had never lived there, like my life was someone else's dream." The cemetery with no stones, the church cemetery, had once held hundreds of graves, some going back to the 14th century. But now, nothing. The stones were removed, the names scratched off, the area flattened. Grass grew where bones once rested. One researcher, hiking the grounds in 1972, noted, "It was like standing in a photograph that had been erased." When asked why no stones were preserved, a government official shrugged, "There are many cemeteries, this one had no significance. But he was wrong, because every cemetery has significance, especially the ones no one wants to remember. And then it was quiet by the 1980s. The last roof had collapsed. The military still used the land occasionally, not for combat, but for practice. Tanks rolled over cracked foundations. Wild boar nested in what used to be the town hall. Some said you could still hear footsteps in the early morning fog, but that was just the wind, right? A shadow with no source today. Döllersheim technically still exists. It's listed in old records, archived photos, military maps. But you can't send mail there. No roads lead to it directly. There's no website, no visitor center. Just a shadow of a place, of a history, of a story that someone tried very hard to erase and perhaps succeeded. Because who remembers a town that was never burned, only dimmed? Who notices the places that are removed not with fire, but with silence? And so we end with this: Döllersheim didn't fall. It didn't break. It wasn't even abandoned in the usual sense. It was silenced, erased not with destruction, but with forgetting. So as you lie in the dark, ask yourself, what does it take for a place to disappear while still standing? You're still here, still listening, still breathing, still surrounded by the quiet details of your life. The walls, the floor, the little objects around you that prove your world is real. Now imagine that someone took none of those things away, but simply made everyone else forget they existed. Not stolen, not broken, just no longer mentioned. That was Döllersheim. Let's explore how a town can be physically untouched, but historically amputated. A case study in quiet deletion. The archive that refused to open. After World War II, historians attempted to trace Döllersheim's administrative history. They wanted to understand how so many original documents had gone missing. Parish registries, gone. Tax ledgers, vanished. Birth and death certificates, selectively missing. The primary archive, located in Vienna, had a file labeled Döllersheim, but it was sealed under non-essential historical holdings. When requested, researchers were told, no materials available, town no longer recognized as active subject of record. It wasn't that the files were destroyed. It was worse, they were misfiled, mislabeled, deliberately misplaced, so that anyone seeking them would simply give up. To this day, Döllersheim has one of the most incomplete municipal archives in Austria. The memory of the old men in 1964, an oral historian named Clara Rheintaler traveled to the Waldviertel region to collect testimonies from elderly Austrians about village life before the war. She found a group of retired farmers living in Krems who had once grown up in Döllersheim. They remembered everything vividly. The taste of well water pulled at sunrise, the church organ that only worked when the bellows were warmed by a fire, a schoolteacher who taught both Latin and sheep shearing. But when she asked about 1938, the year the evacuations began, they hesitated. One man said, "We were told it was for national defense that we were lucky to serve. We weren't told not to return, but when we tried, the roads weren't there anymore." Another said simply, "They didn't burn our homes, they burned our trail." The military's quiet role. The Wehrmacht didn't destroy Döllersheim, they repurposed it. After the evacuations, the village became part of the Truppenübungsplatz Döllersheim, a vast military training area. But they didn't need the homes, the chapel or the cemetery. So they let time do the work. They didn't knock down the buildings. They let the wind do it. They didn't remove the people from memory. They just didn't let them come back. Years later, Austrian defense officials would claim no cultural heritage was intentionally destroyed, and technically that was true, but erasure doesn't always require violence. Sometimes it just needs permission to forget. Tourists who couldn't find it in the 1980s, a small wave of interest stirred among amateur historians and travelers. Some tried to visit what remained of Döllersheim. They found themselves lost in a strange pattern of wrong turns and incomplete directions. Locals gave vague answers. That place is gone, they would say. It's part of the range now. One group, armed with a 1927 map, followed an old cattle path. They reached a clearing and found what they believed was the remnants of the chapel, only the foundation left. A rusted military sign leaned against a stump. "Keep out, unexploded ordnance." That was all. No history plaque, no apology. No explanation. The danger of being inconvenient Döllersheim's true misfortune may not have been what happened there, but who had once been tied to it. The Hitler ancestry controversy, vague, unresolved, possibly apocryphal, became a political liability, not to the dictator himself, but to the image of the state. And so the town became inconvenient, and in regimes built on myth and spectacle, inconveniences don't get corrected. They get buried. A single photograph that remains, one surviving photograph. Five Döllersheims, dated 1936, shows a narrow street lined with lime trees. Children are playing with hoops. A man in a vest carries a bucket past a woman in a linen apron. It's unremarkable, but look closely and you'll see it. A small chalk mark on the doorway of one house. Historians later speculated this was an inventory mark, part of a survey done just before evacuation. A quiet prelude to forgetting, because once the mark was made, it didn't matter how many games were played, how many buckets were carried, how many prayers were whispered. The house had already been chosen to vanish. Modern attempts at memory in recent decades, local heritage groups have attempted to preserve what's left. One group reconstructed a partial chapel wall using salvaged stones. Another compiled oral testimonies from descendants of the displaced. But there's no funding, no tourism, no government initiative. A small stone by the roadside reads, "Hier war Döllersheim." Here was Döllersheim. That's it. No more. Context. No more explanation. Because when memory is suppressed long enough, even attempts at revival feel like trespassing. And so we end with a thought. The worst kind of destruction isn't loud. It isn't fire or flood. It's when a place is gently encouraged to leave the narrative, when every map shrinks it, when every archive misfiles it, when people stop asking and eventually stop caring. Döllersheim wasn't murdered, it was uninvited from history. So tonight, as the dark settles around you, ask yourself, what traces would remain if your life was erased from paper, but not from soil? The room around you is probably still. Your thoughts slower now, the world soft and far away. Let's stay like this as we close the chapter on Döllersheim, the town that didn't die in the usual ways, no plague, no fire, no invasion. And yet it's gone. This is not a ghost story. Ghosts need memory. This is a story about absence and the deepest kind, the one that stays unnoticed. The generation who chose not to return. By the 1970s, most of the people who had been born in Döllersheim were in their final decades of life. Some had moved to Vienna. Others had drifted into neighboring towns like Zwettl or Weidhofen. A few lived just kilometers away, but almost none of them went back. Not because they were forbidden, because they didn't know what was left to return to. Woman named Hilda, born in Döllersheim in 1923, told a radio interviewer, "I dreamed of it once. I was carrying bread, and the street was gone. Only the air remembered how to hold the houses, and I walked through it like mist." The forest took back. The town nature doesn't mourn. It doesn't ask for permission. It simply fills the gaps. By the late 20th century, birch trees had pushed through the floorboards of old homes. Roots cracked wells. Ivy climbed the chapel walls like a final psalm. One Austrian ecologist remarked, "It is not ruins you find here. It is forgetting in progress." You could still find brick outlines beneath moss, hints of roads beneath soft patches of wild grass. Sometimes in spring, lilacs bloomed where someone once planted them long ago. A garden surviving its gardener by half a century, but there were no names left, no signs, just growth. When the absence becomes the memory, one of the strangest parts of Döllersheim's story is that its absence has become more memorable than its history. Tourists now visit, not for what's there, but for what's not. One visitor wrote, "It's the only place I've ever been where I felt like I was interrupting the air." What they mean is this: the town does not feel haunted. It feels unfinished, like it is still in the process of being erased. And somehow you've arrived too early or too late. The silence of official history. To this day, Austrian school textbooks mention Döllersheim only in passing, if at all. Its evacuation is described as part of strategic wartime realignment. Its population displacement labeled non-critical. But no student is told how a name was quietly removed from church records. No curriculum covers how genealogy was altered. No exam asks about the church bells that were taken and never rung again, because Döllersheim isn't considered part of a larger historical tragedy. It's just forgotten. The kind of place where no crime was ever committed, just a decision was made and no one questioned it. The stones that shouldn't be moved in 2002, during a drought, the soil around the ruined church shifted. For the first time in decades, parts of the cemetery surfaced. Not full stones, but shards. One showed part of a name, Ilda. Another bore the year 179. Locals debated whether to preserve the site or leave it alone. One elderly man, the son of a former parish caretaker, left a note on the chapel door: "Let the stones sleep. They've already been moved too many times." The note was taken down. The stones had disappeared again under grass. The place that refuses to be haunted, Döllersheim, doesn't act like a ghost town. There are no creepy legends, no tales of curses or echoes, no flickering lights in the woods, no stories of weeping figures. Instead, people say the land feels reluctant, like it's trying not to remember itself, like it's trying to stay quiet. As if the erasure went so deep, even the soil flinches at the idea of being seen again. And maybe that's the scariest kind of forgotten, the kind that doesn't even want to be recovered. A shadow left on the wall. There's an expression in German, Schatten ohne Licht, a shadow without light. It means something that lingers after its source is gone. That's Döllersheim, not a ruin, not a relic, a shadow. The outline of a life that's no longer visible, but not quite gone either. And like all shadows, it moves, differently depending on who looks. Some see lost history, some see political embarrassment, some see nothing at all, but the shadow remains, even without flame. Final reflection, what it means to be remembered. Wrong, we often think the worst fate is to be forgotten, but maybe worse is to be remembered wrong. Döllersheim was once a place where children played, where bells rang, where people woke up each morning thinking about nothing bigger than bread and winter. Now it's a footnote, a speculation, a symbol for something it never chose to represent. And yet, in this quiet moment, you know it. You've walked its mossy paths in your mind. You've seen the church that isn't there. You've stood where someone once stood, hoping their town would outlive them. And in a way it has, because tonight you are its witness. And that may be the only kind of afterlife a place like this can ask for. What time is it where you are? What day is it? Strange question, maybe. But imagine waking up one morning, walking outside and learning that the day you thought it was doesn't exist anymore. Not metaphorically, not emotionally. Literally, it has been erased. Now imagine that this tiny, invisible erasure would eventually help bring down an empire. This is the story of how a kingdom miscounted its days, and how something as dull and bureaucratic as a calendar reform became the quiet beginning of its end. Let's go back to Sweden in the early 18th century, and let's start with a single missing day, the country that tried to outsmart time in. 1700. Most of Europe had moved to the Gregorian calendar, the one we use today. It was cleaner, more accurate, and corrected the 10 extra minutes the old Julian calendar added every year. The Catholic countries switched first. Then the Protestant ones followed. But Sweden decided to get clever. Rather than jumping forward by 11 days all at once, like England and Germany eventually would, Sweden planned to phase in the change slowly over the course of 40 years. Here was the plan. From 1700 to 1740, Sweden would skip all leap years. Each skipped leap year would gradually bring their calendar into sync with the Gregorian system. No panic, no confusion, just quiet, bureaucratic progress. It was perfect. On paper. The problem with good plans: the first skipped leap year happened as scheduled, 1700. Sweden quietly left it out. No February 29th, no fanfare. But then things began to fall apart. Sweden entered a long and violent war, the Great Northern War, against Russia, Poland, and Denmark. In the chaos, the government forgot to skip the next leap years, 1704 and 1708. Yes, they forgot. This meant that by 1710, Sweden was 1 day off from the Julian calendar and 10 days off from the Gregorian. They were now on a third calendar, used by no one else in the world. A kingdom without a common clock. This might sound like a trivial inconvenience, but it wasn't. Merchants missed shipments. Church holidays were celebrated on the wrong days. Foreign correspondents couldn't agree on dates. One confused diplomat even arrived to sign a treaty a week early and was nearly turned away as a fraud. The Swedish Navy accidentally launched an offensive on the Feast of St. Olaf, offending local allies. Farmers planted too early or too late, and worst of all, taxes were collected twice in 1 year due to a clerical error involving mismatched dates. The people began whispering, "If the crown can't count the days, how can it count the people?" The calendar riot. That wasn't there. Was no mass rebellion, no uprising in the streets, but in several rural regions, and especially in Västergötland, town records show a rise in calendar refusals. That is, entire communities simply ignored the official Swedish calendar and followed either the old Julian one or the Gregorian version used by Catholic neighbors. One church even celebrated Easter twice in 1712, once in March and again in April. When royal inspectors asked why, the priest replied, "Until the king speaks with God, we must hedge our bets." It was said only half-jokingly. How a correction became a crisis by 1711, the situation was so absurd that even King Charles, Thorstein, who was busy fighting in the mudlands of Eastern Europe, had to weigh in. His solution? Abandon the experiment. Sweden would return to the Julian calendar, the old one. They would pretend the last decade of fiddling never happened. To do this, they added an extra day to the calendar. And so, in Sweden, the year 1712 included a date that existed nowhere else in the world. February 30th. One lonely bureaucratic ghost of a day. A kingdom that lost its rhythm by itself. This calendar misfire didn't topple Sweden, but it deepened the cracks. It undermined trust in the crown's competence. It disrupted trade with European partners. It added a layer of surreal confusion to an already losing war. More importantly, it shattered the shared rhythm of society. Time, once consistent and sacred, was now negotiable. People began to doubt not just the monarchy's ability to govern war, but to govern reality. A preacher in Uppsala said in a sermon, "A kingdom that cannot keep the Sabbath on the same day is a kingdom too lost for saving." What does it mean to lose time? We tend to think of time as inevitable, unchangeable, unforgiving. But history shows us it's surprisingly malleable and surprisingly political. And when those in power alter it poorly or lose control of it entirely, the result isn't just confusion, it's unraveling. People lose their rituals, lose their seasons, lose their sense of what matters and when, and that kind of drift is hard to reverse. The forgotten day. There's no celebration for February 30th in Sweden. No marker, no holiday, no reenactments. It has faded from public awareness, a technical curiosity buried in academic footnotes. But it happened. The state created a day out of thin air, then never spoke of it again. A date that meant nothing, observed by no one, and still capable of leaving a mark on a country's timeline. Imagine that, one day, one phantom, echoing louder than 1,000 battles. And so we end this section with a thought: Sweden's calendar. Crisis didn't involve war crimes or moral failures, just small quiet miscalculations, minor bureaucratic delays, and a belief that time would obey paperwork. But time doesn't care about paperwork. So tonight, before you drift off, think of the world we live in, of how every date on your calendar is a fragile agreement, and ask yourself, what happens when the people no longer believe the calendar, but the calendar keeps turning anyway? Still with me? The world around you is likely quiet, steady, predictable, but in early 18th century Sweden, even time itself wasn't dependable. We've already seen how Sweden's experiment with calendar reform backfired, how the kingdom ended up on its own bizarre timeline, how a single date, February 30th, 1712, existed only once in all of history. Now let's explore what happened after the day passed. What do you do when your people no longer trust the clock? When farmers, priests, merchants, and kings all follow different versions of the same reality? This section is about what happens when you don't just lose a day. You lose consensus. The recovery that never quite recovered. After reinstating the Julian calendar in 1712, the Swedish crown issued a royal proclamation. Henceforth, all civil, religious, and commercial activities are to adhere strictly to the Julian calendar under penalty of fine and correction. The intent was clear: restore order, synchronize clocks, realign society, but it didn't work. Too many people had adapted to local timekeeping. Some used Gregorian calendars from German traders. Others followed older agricultural almanacs that didn't match either system. Rural villages, especially in the north, invented hybrid calendars that included feast days no longer recognized by the church. For the first time in centuries, Sweden was fractured. not by borders, religion, or war, but by days. The loss of trust in the clock tower. Every town in Sweden had a church tower, and every tower had a clock. But after the calendar fiasco, people stopped looking up. They started carrying pocket time, sand timers, homemade dials, string-bound journals with corrected schedules. The church bells rang, but fewer people arrived on time. One priest in Jämtland complained, "I ring the hour, but the pews fill like a leaking jug. No man agrees with his neighbor what time it is." It wasn't just frustrating, it was destabilizing, because in a world without synchronized time, no one can be late and no one can be early. Everyone becomes right and wrong at once. Time. As political allegiance, the calendar crisis soon took on a new layer. It became political. Those loyal to the monarchy followed the reimposed Julian calendar. Those with Catholic or German sympathies quietly used the Gregorian. And a third group, skeptics, dissidents, or just confused citizens, followed neither, choosing instead to rely on local rhythms, harvest moons, frost patterns, and folk holidays. In effect, Sweden split into 3 timelines. When one region held elections, another was observing a fast. When one district celebrated Easter, another was preparing for Lent. When royal inspectors came to collect taxes, farmers claimed it was still the previous year. It wasn't rebellion, it was worse. Disagreement without confrontation. A kingdom where no one could agree on what day it was, and no one wanted to argue about it anymore. How history becomes hard to date. Historians studying this era have faced an ironic problem. They can't agree on the exact dates of certain events. Was a rebellion in 1714 or 1713? Did the Easter uprising in Malmö start on April 1st or April 12th? Was a royal edict issued before or after a sermon that referenced it? The documents exist, but the calendars don't match, because many officials backdated or postdated their reports to match either the Julian or Gregorian reckoning, whichever their audience preferred. It's as if time itself split in the archive, and in some cases, we can't tell if things happened out of order or if the clocks just lied. The peasant almanacs, one of the quietest rebellions, came not from soldiers or priests, but from farmers. In the years following 1712, dozens of handwritten peasant almanacs began circulating. They weren't official, they weren't accurate, but they felt trustworthy. These small booklets, bound in scraps of leather or cloth, included planting cycles, weather signs, feast days, and dream interpretations. But most importantly, they included custom dates, days, with names like the True Sunday, the Hidden Solstice, the Day the King Lied, Lost Thursday. These weren't real holidays, they were protests, written in ink and preserved in kitchen drawers. The whisper of superstition. In time, the confusion took a darker turn. When time becomes untrustworthy, superstition fills the void. Children born on February 30th were said to bring famine. Weddings, held during false Lent, a period caused by calendar overlap, were rumored to doom marriages. Travelers who crossed from Gregorian towns into Julian ones without cleansing rituals were blamed for bad weather. These weren't official beliefs, but they spread, because when people can't trust the state to keep time, they begin looking for meaning elsewhere, in stars, in dreams, in accidents. A monarch in a foreign war zone. Meanwhile, King Charles IV, the very monarch who approved the calendar reversal, was nowhere near Sweden. He was fighting in the Great Northern War deep, in enemy territory, with no direct control over his kingdom's internal stability. His absence didn't help. When a king isn't present to clarify the date, rumors rise. He died last Tuesday, but they'll tell us next month. He returned already, but we're on the wrong calendar to know it. He will declare a new year by mouth alone. This wasn't treason. It was confusion mutating into folklore. Because when power drifts too far from its people, even time becomes a myth. A country without a shared now. By 1716, Sweden was functionally operating on different clocks in different places, and that's more dangerous than it sounds. Without shared time, you lose. Shared mourning. Deaths go unaligned. Shared celebration. Holidays miss their meaning. Shared expectation. Trust dissolves. And once those cracks appear, you don't need revolution to bring down a kingdom. You just need delay. Small gaps between orders and execution. Between edicts and obedience. Between now and then. The kingdom becomes asynchronous, like an orchestra where no one hears the same beat. And so we end with this. Sweden survived the calendar crisis, eventually switching to the Gregorian system in 1753, over 50 years after its first failed attempt. But the damage lingered, because what the kingdom learned, too late, was this. Time isn't just minutes and days. It's trust, it's agreement, it's shared reality, and when a government loses control of that, it loses more than a day. It loses the rhythm that holds a nation together. Everything ends. Even this strange little story about missing leap years and phantom dates. But before we finish, let's stay with Sweden a little longer, not just to trace what happened, but to understand what was left behind. We've seen how time drifted apart, how communities stopped agreeing on what now meant, how a monarch tried to undo his own decision by adding a day that never should have existed. But what happens after a kingdom misplaces time? This is the story of how Sweden tried to reclaim its rhythm and what it lost along the way. The year 1753, a national reset on March. First, 1753, the Swedish government finally made its bold leap. After decades of awkward dates, misaligned holy days, and ritual confusion, the nation abandoned the Julian calendar and fully adopted the Gregorian system. To do it, they simply erased 11 days. February 17th was followed immediately by March 1st. No February 18th, no 19th, no 20th. Gone. It was the correction they'd delayed for half a century. The papers called it a cleansing of the clock. The clergy called it a divine rebalancing. The peasants called it the theft of days. A population that didn't feel corrected. The crown had expected gratitude. Instead, it got silence. Merchants complained that rents were charged for full months that no longer existed. Farmers were uncertain when to plant. Wives demanded clarity. On wedding anniversaries, some of which now seemed to fall into a void. One diarist wrote, "I have lived honestly my whole life, but now 11 days are stolen from me, and I shall die 11 days sooner. What is the worth of a king who steals time?" He wasn't alone. Many people refused to cross out the missing days in their journals. Some added them to the margins. Others simply kept using the old calendar, scribbled beneath the new. Reluctant time. Even after the switch, Sweden wasn't synchronized with itself. Some churches used the new calendar for holidays, but the old one for internal records. Rural districts celebrated Christmas a week late. One town, Fogelfors, held midsummer celebrations in July, and again in August, just to be sure. In a desperate attempt to normalize things, the government sent agents to deliver corrected almanacs to all parishes. They came with detailed instructions, printed prayers, and recommended dates for feasts. Most were quietly ignored. One priest sent his back with a note. "We will honor God on the days he chooses, not the ones Parliament edits. Generations born without the days they lived in." This is a strange part of the story. There are people who were born in the erased window of February 18th, 28, 1700, who never lived to see those days return. They aged, died, and were buried, while their own birthdays technically didn't exist in the official record. They became known as time orphans, not a legal term, just a whisper of folklore. In some towns, people who shared those lost birthdays were believed to have bad luck, to be skipped over by fortune, to be less real superstition, of course, but meaningful, because it shows how deeply we rely on shared structure, even for our own sense of existence. When your birthday disappears, who are you? The ghosts in the clock tower. Some towns refused to adjust their church clocks for years after the reform. They claimed the mechanisms couldn't be trusted. That time should be kept in the body, by sun and hunger and sleep, not gears. There's one record from the coastal town of Sundsvall where a councilman removed the clock's hands entirely, saying, "If we cannot agree on what hour it is, let the tower be silent until we do." It took 12 years before they replaced the mechanism. By then, the tower had become known as the Mute Witness, a history that cannot be chronological. You might be wondering, did this calendar mess actually kill the Swedish kingdom? The answer technically is no, but it weakened it. Sweden's decline in the 18th century had many causes: war losses, shifting alliances, a weakened monarchy, and economic stagnation. But the calendar crisis played a role, not because it caused suffering, but because it embodied the failure of control. If the government couldn't manage days and months, the most basic units of shared national rhythm, how could it manage armies, trade, law? The collapse of trust in time mirrored a collapse in trust in the state. And when time fails, everything slips. The day that shouldn't exist, but still does. Let's return, briefly, to February 30th, 1712, the one-time-only date created to undo the calendar reform. It is not commemorated. No public holidays, no school lessons, no statues, and yet it exists. A real day, a ghost in the timeline. No one celebrates it, but maybe we should. Not as a holiday, but as a reminder that the systems we trust, the clocks, the calendars, the dates born are fragile. They depend on agreement, on clarity, on belief. Without that, they crumble, and we are left asking not, what time is it, but whose time is it? A final reflection tonight, as your eyes grow heavy, as minutes stretch and blur, as the edges of the day soften into shadow. Think of Sweden, not as a frozen land of pine and snow, but as a country that tried to negotiate with time, that tried to bend the calendar quietly, to fix the past politely, to manage the present in advance. And ask yourself, if we lose our rhythm, even by one day, do we ever truly find it again? What time is it for you? Late? Early? Somewhere in between? Doesn't matter. Because where we're going, time doesn't pass in a straight line. It folds, loops, echoes. The past and present share walls. We're going to a castle, but not one. You'll find in history books about conquest or glory. This castle never fell to an invader. It was never stormed, never breached. Instead, it unraveled from within. This is the story of Chaktica Castle, a fortress in what is now Slovakia, a place where betrayal wore a crown, where loyalty became its own weapon, and where the castle, piece by piece, began to war against itself, not in fire, not in blood, but in silence. A fortress with no clear enemy, Chaktica Castle was built in the 13th century as a defensive stronghold against Mongol invasions. At its height, it was surrounded by thick forests, perched on a limestone hill like a frozen howl. Its walls were thick, its towers tall, its cellars deep. It was designed to withstand anything: siege, famine, isolation. But its greatest enemy wasn't outside. It was inside and human and bound by oath. The arrival of the Countess. You may have heard of Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, they called her. A noblewoman accused of torturing and killing scores of young women in the early 1600s. But this isn't her story. Not really. Because by the time she was arrested, tried and sealed inside her own chambers by royal decree, Chakticha Castle had already begun to splinter. The servants turned on one another. The guards whispered about ghosts. The steward refused to ring the bells. Why? Because the very architecture of the castle had been designed for obedience, not survival. And when obedience cracked, so did the walls. A castle designed for hierarchy. Chaktis wasn't built like most castles. It had no central keep, no easy rally point. Instead, it was designed as a tiered complex, and every section reporting up, room by room, stair by stair. Servants were kept low, near the wet cellars. Nobles lived in narrow towers, accessible only by permission. The Abbas kitchens and chapel were at odds, separated by a series of blind corners and sound-muffling corridors. There was no place for unity, only delegation. And when the center collapsed, when Elizabeth was imprisoned in her own suite, the castle's design no longer served purpose. It became a maze, a shell, a structure that couldn't communicate with itself, the mutiny of routine. After the Countess's confinement in 1610, her household remained. They weren't executed, not all of them. Some were pardoned, some were reassigned. A skeleton. Staff was kept to maintain appearances, but no one gave orders, and no one trusted each other. The steward would not eat food from the cook's hands. The cook would not deliver meals to the imprisoned lady. The guards rotated patrols that no longer protected anything. Letters went unread. Repairs were abandoned. One chronicler visiting from the Hungarian court noted, "The stones weep from neglect. They seem to resent their own purpose, the locking in of the Countess. Let's talk about what sealed meant." Elizabeth Bathory wasn't executed. Instead, she was bricked into a chamber, a single room with one narrow slot for food and waste. She was neither visible nor audible to the rest of the castle, but she was still present, and presence, when confined, becomes haunting. Even those who didn't believe in ghosts reported the sense that her absence was somehow louder than her presence had ever been. They left her food and whispered apologies. Some nights, guards refused to make the walk to her wing, not out of fear, but out of confusion. Who was in charge now? No one knew. The castle without a voice. Once Chaktich had been full of sounds, footsteps, bells, prayers, punishments. After the fall, those sounds stopped. What remained was the drip of cellar water, the scratch of mice in empty storerooms, the wind threading through archways built to echo orders that no longer came. People stopped ringing the dinner bell, stopped lighting the lamps at dusk. The chapel went unused. Not because it was forbidden, but because no one remembered the schedule anymore. Without a central figure, the routines collapsed, and when routine dies, silence becomes the ruler. The inventory that made no sense. Years later, a royal inspector arrived to survey the castle's holdings. His records list: 16 chairs, none matching, 24 keys, most unlabeled, 1 bell rope tied in a noose, 24 unopened letters addressed to My Lady. and a single locked door with no known key. When asked who was responsible for maintaining the ledgers, the staff had no answer. Some claimed the steward, some claimed the ghost of the Countess. One simply said, "We keep records for ourselves." Now, it was no longer a castle. It was a village trapped in stone, each resident isolated by suspicion and architecture. The collapse from within. By 1614, when Elizabeth finally died in her chamber, the castle was practically deserted. The kitchen was cold, the chapel mouldy, the walls overgrown with moss. No enemy had attacked, no battle had been fought, but the place had ceased to function. It's the kind of collapse that happens slowly, not with fire, but with forgetfulness, not with revolt, but with routines, left unkept, the kind of decay that mimics sleep. And so we end with this: Chaktis castle was never sacked, never burned, never besieged, and yet it fell to itself, because even stone needs purpose, even walls need a center, and when that center becomes a sealed room, well, what else can the castle do but crumble quietly? So tonight, before sleep, takes you ask, what keeps your house standing, the walls or the people who move between them? Still awake, let your mind drift back into the heavy stone walls of Chaktis Castle. There's no fire here, no clang of swords, just corridors too narrow for company, doors that lead nowhere and staircases that echo with their own emptiness. This section isn't about the Countess anymore. It's about what happens when a fortress built for control outlives its controller. When the rooms remain, but no one remembers how to use them. When the place begins to erase its own function, and all that's left is form without purpose. This is about a castle at war with itself, not violently, but structurally, a fortress built for secrecy. Let's look closer at Chaktis's design. This wasn't a welcoming stronghold. It was engineered for hierarchy and suspicion. No single hallway connected the entire upper level. Movement required permission and escort. The guards' quarters were isolated from the kitchens. Certain stairwells turned sharply, not for space, but to slow down retreat or chase. It worked well when everyone had a role. But after the fall of the Countess, the roles broke down. Without an external enemy, the fortress turned its defensive posture inward. People no longer moved freely. They hesitated at corners. Doors were left locked, not to keep others out, but because no one could remember who held the keys. The steward who refused to open the gate. After Elizabeth was sealed in her chamber, the steward, one Benedek Horvath, became the castle's de facto authority. But he wasn't a leader. He was a caretaker. And in the absence of command, he froze. He refused to open the castle's main gate after dusk, even to royal couriers. He maintained the larder inventory meticulously, but stopped feeding the outer quarters. He locked the wine cellar, not out of discipline, but because he feared what would happen if the wrong person drank too much, too close to the wrong rumor. In his logbook he wrote, "Better stillness than another accusation." It wasn't leadership, it was defensive paralysis, rooms that forgot. Their use with no active command and fewer servants, rooms fell into ambiguity. The servants' hall became a sleeping chamber for guards. The priests' quarters were used to store broken tools. The old nursery was repurposed as an animal shelter during winter. There was no rebellion, just drift. Rooms were still named but not used as intended. Schedules were followed, but they no longer made sense. Someone would ring the breakfast bell at the wrong hour. Someone would prepare meals for guests who hadn't existed in years. A castle slowly untethered from context, not haunted, just misaligned, like a watch that still ticks, but tells no one the correct time. The locked Wing 1 part of the castle remained sealed even after Elizabeth's death. The Western Wing, originally meant as guest quarters, it had been closed off entirely after her imprisonment, not because it was cursed, but because no one agreed who was allowed in anymore. Some believed it had once housed accomplices. Others feared old evidence remained. A few simply didn't like the draft that came through its broken shutters, so they locked it. And when the key was lost, they let the door rot closed. Years later, when the castle was surveyed, inspectors found the entire wing filled with nothing. No furniture, no footprints. Only air, mildew, and silence. A castle that heard too much sound in Chaktic was strange. Even at its peak, the castle was designed to contain noise, not carry it. Whispers stayed trapped in stone. Footsteps vanished down angled halls. Cries from the dungeons echoed only downward. But after the Countess was sealed in her chamber, something changed. Servants reported sounds that didn't make sense. Knocks from walls where no rooms were. Footsteps that started but didn't end. Bells ringing without hands to pull them. Again, this isn't a ghost story. These were acoustic artifacts, echoes without a source, created by a building slowly forgetting what its soundscape used to mean. Noise without context, motion without memory, the disappearance of orders. The strangest phase came in the 1620s, long after the Countess's death, when the castle was still technically occupied, but nothing was being done. There were people. Inside they swept, they tended small fires. They opened shutters in the morning, but no new orders were ever issued. The castle became a self-repeating system, like a wind-up toy left to run. A visiting official in 1626 reported, "I spent 4 days within its walls and never once heard a command spoken." The people moved like relics, not to serve, but to imitate the past. It was a castle performing its own ghost play, with no audience and no script. When stone forgets its purpose, eventually the structure itself began to fail. Cracks in the chapel dome, frost in the inner keep, vines creeping through library windows. No repairs were made, not because there were no tools, but because no one knew who had the authority to repair them. Power, once concentrated, had scattered so completely that even maintenance became politicized. Should a guard fix a roof? Should the cook patch a wall? The answer was always the same. It's not my place, and so nothing was done, until the roof caved, until the walls split, until Chaktic became its own ruin. A slow and silent fall. By the mid-1600s, the castle was still standing, technically, but no one lived there full-time. Supplies stopped arriving. Letters were returned unopened. It was a place with no residents, only caretakers of memory, people who swept rooms no one entered, and tended altars no one prayed before. They weren't keeping the place alive. They were keeping it still, and so we end with this. Chaktic was built for defense, but it was undone not by siege or sword, but by the failure to reassign purpose. It had one function, to serve a powerful family. When that function vanished, it couldn't adapt, and so it kept going, without direction, until stillness became collapse. It is a warning, not about betrayal or cruelty, but about what happens when a system becomes incapable of repurposing itself. So tonight, as the edges of sleep close in, ask yourself, what parts of your world still exist, only because no one told them to stop? You're almost asleep now, but before you go, let's visit a place where even the stones gave up on being stones, where a castle didn't burn or fall, It refused to be remembered. This is the final part of the story. Not of Elizabeth Bathory, not of the servants, not of any one person, but of the castle itself. What happens to a place when it loses not just its people, but its meaning? The ruin that wasn't attacked. By the 1700s, Chactich Castle was listed in regional ledgers as a derelict structure. No, one officially decommissioned it. No army shelled it. No local population tore it apart, but it was functionally gone. Roofs had collapsed. Doors warped off their hinges. Moss-covered inscriptions no one could translate anymore. A traveler described it as a castle that no longer remembers what castles are for. That's not poetic metaphor. It's architectural truth. Because over time, every part of Chactiche was reduced to shape without purpose. Towers that didn't guard. Gates that didn't close. Rooms that didn't hold anything but stale air and animal droppings. The building was still present, but its castleness had left. The locals who looked away. The nearby villagers in Chactiche town, just downhill, didn't salvage the castle. Not much, anyway. A few took stones for wells. One rumor claimed a noble family stole a window frame, but no real looting happened. Why? Because the castle had taken on a strange silence. Not fear, just discomfort. A place so associated with stillness, accusation, and misused power that no one wanted its parts. One carpenter, when offered the old banqueting table from the keep, reportedly said, "The table still listens," and refused, the ghost of the chapel. Bell, one piece of the castle, was taken, the chapel bell, moved to a smaller church down the hill in the late 18th century. It was restored and used briefly, but parishioners said the sound was wrong. Dull, heavy. Flat, one priest noted. It rings as if it regrets being heard. The bell was taken down and stored in a shed, then forgotten. It was found in the 1920s, cracked and half buried in ivy. No one could say who moved it last, the tourists who found nothing. In the 19th century, romantic ruins became fashionable. Travelers sought out abandoned castles, crumbling towers, and legends of lost nobility. Chactiche drew some attention, mostly for its association with the Blood Countess. Writers came looking for Gothic horror. They didn't find it. One visitor in 1847 wrote, "There is no drama here. No shadow, no echo, only a quiet refusal to explain itself. No tragic portraits, no tortured ruins, no storybook decay, just emptiness. The kind that doesn't weep, the kind that simply turned away. The restoration that failed in the 20th century. Efforts were made to restore part of the castle. Masons repaired a wall. Tourism boards proposed signage. A walking path was cleared, but the work was slow. Funding disappeared. Most who visited reported feeling underwhelmed, not because the site lacked history, but because it resisted performance. There were no guided tours that made sense, no clear narrative arc, no defining event to pin to the place. It was simply a castle that forgot how to be one, and the world forgot how to talk about it. Stone as memory. Here's a strange truth. Stone forgets more easily than we think. We imagine buildings as permanent, but permanence isn't about material, it's about meaning. When purpose vanishes, even the strongest walls become hollow. Chactich Castle had no glorious fall, no noble end, no martyrdom. It simply ran out of function, and no one stopped it. A place that refused to be a symbol in modern Slovakia, Chactiche is sometimes referenced in connection with Elizabeth Bathory, sometimes with tourism, occasionally with medieval architecture, but it has no clear identity, not even as a ruin. It is a place that was used, then sealed, then whispered about, then walked past, then quietly folded into the hillside as if the earth had decided to keep it a secret. And maybe that's what it wanted, not to be remembered, not to be mythologized, just to be left, a final reflection. As you lie here still and fading into sleep, think of Chakticha, a castle that never fell because it was never pushed, a castle that died because no one told it what to be anymore. It's a strange kind of ending. No climax, no battle, no fire, just silence and the slow erosion of certainty. So tonight, ask yourself, what parts of your world will crumble, not from force, but from being left with no role to play? What time is it now? Are you in bed? Sitting quietly, listening? Good. Hold still. Now imagine a village where people stopped breathing aloud, not because they were dead, but because the air itself had become suspect. They began to speak in whispers, sleep far apart, refuse to share space, as not from hatred, but from a quiet, growing terror of breath itself. This is the story of a plague that never made headlines, had no proper name, and left behind no epic paintings or saints, only silence. This is the story of Almissa, a real town once part of the Dalmatian coast, and the illness that didn't just kill its people, but made them afraid to exhale. The town on the wind's edge, Almissa, today called Omish, is nestled between cliffs and sea, a pinched inlet on Croatia's coast. In the 18th century, it was a sleepy maritime town under Venetian rule. Known more for its olive groves and tiny port than for politics or wealth, the cliffs around it formed a natural tunnel, a wind corridor where the Bura, the cold northeasterly wind, blew violently through the streets in winter. Fishermen called it the bone flayer. Children were told it could peel the thoughts from your head, but no one feared it until 1783. The first unnamed symptoms. That winter, the Bura came earlier than expected, harsher, sharper. It flattened laundry lines, tore shutters from walls, cracked roof tiles, and then people began to cough. Not dramatically, not bloodily, just persistently. Children with wheezing lungs, grandparents whose breath grew shallow, sailors who returned from sea unable to walk upstairs. The doctor, at the time a man named Luca Marinelli, noted in his log, "There is no fever, no rash, no boil, only breath that seems to forget how to be drawn." He advised rest, warm milk, and silence. Silence became the cure. A town that held its breath within a month, the symptoms had spread to nearly every home. Still no deaths, but a growing tension settled over Almissa, a hesitation in doorways, a second thought before greeting someone, a decision to sleep with one's back to the room. People began to tie cloth over their mouths, not because they were told to, but because it felt right. Stop singing. Stop praying aloud. Close windows even when the air grew stale. It was the first known case in regional history of community-wide breath suppression, not a mandate, just an agreement, built from fear and carried on wind. No one. To blame, nowhere to run. Unlike other plagues, Almissa's wind illness didn't come with visible signs. No pustules, no swelling, no blackened limbs. And so the usual scapegoats, rats, water, meat, were spared. Instead, the fear turned inward. Neighbors suspected each other's coughs. Couples separated beds. The church bell was silenced to avoid gathering a crowd. Father Vinko, the parish priest, wrote, "The air is thick with caution. Not grief, not anger, just the deep, cold waiting that comes before something worse. He held Mass with the doors open, and no one came, a plague without a pattern. Most plagues follow a pattern, a curve of contagion, a surge, then a slow retreat. But Almissa's illness didn't spike, it hovered. For 19 months, the town lived in a low, consistent fear, a steady rate of illness, no massive deaths, no visible sign of healing either. People simply stopped living in full. They ate separately, wrote instead of spoke, avoided birthdays, mourned before people died. It was a kind of emotional quarantine, and when the governor of Split finally sent a physician team, they found no conclusive pathogen, just townsfolk who looked at the wind, like it was a messenger of death. The medical report that said nothing. The official report from the Venetian doctors included the phrase, "No observable agent, no common diet, no fever. Diagnosis, mass respiratory fatigue, likely psychosomatic." They blamed the cold. They blamed anxiety. They suggested the people were too tightly bound to tradition and should increase cheer. But they left the town quickly. Even they wore cloth over their mouths. Even they refused to share cups. Even they stopped talking in the final hours of daylight when the wind pressed harder against the shutters. Their silence said more than their ink the wind as a carrier of memory. By the spring of 1785, something changed. The bureau receded. The coughs faded. The silence, however, remained. Almissa didn't erupt in joy. It didn't rejoice or celebrate. It simply carried on carefully. Many people never raised their voices again. Family dinners remained quiet affairs. Public festivals were skipped. Just this year, then the next, and the next again. Children were told, "Speak soft. The wind still listens." The illness had passed, but its behavior remained. The archive of breathing, Dr. Marinelli's journal preserved in a regional archive, is strange. His final entry in 1786 reads, "No funerals this month, but also no weddings. I wonder if a town can survive without sound. If a people who whisper for long enough forget how to shout. If caution becomes culture." He died of unrelated causes a year later. His notes were never published. Not because they weren't useful, but because no one wanted to believe that a town could almost die from air. And so we end with this. No great artist painted the plague of Almissa. No monument lists its victims. No textbook mentions its silence. But for nearly 2 years, a town lived as if every breath was a risk, and maybe that's worse than death. To live half alive, afraid to exhale. So as you lie in the quiet, your own breath soft and steady, ask yourself, what fears still shape your movements? Not because they're true, but because someone, somewhere, once believed the wind could carry silence. You're still here, breathing quietly, listening to a story that almost no one tells. That's the right way to hear this one, because the illness in Almissa didn't kill loudly. It changed behaviors, bent habits, turned noise into danger and talking into taboo. The plague was never confirmed. The wind never explained itself. But what followed was even stranger than the fear. The silence stayed. Let's explore how a town can survive a disease, but never recover from its defense against it. The first generation born after the wind by 1790, a full 5 years had passed since the worst of Almissa's wind sickness. The air was clear, the winds less violent. No one had reported symptoms in months, and yet church bells still rang softly, muffled with cloth. Town criers tapped bells instead of shouting. Public speakers stood behind screens, not out of necessity, but tradition. A generation of children grew up thinking loudness itself was dangerous. Some were never taught lullabies. Others believed talking while walking uphill could let the wind inside. Their parents didn't know how to explain why. They just repeated what had been whispered to them. Breathe quiet, stay safe, don't tempt the wind. Superstition. Become schedule soon, the behavior became structured. Rules emerged, not formal laws but social expectations. Markets opened only during still air. Arguments were delayed until nighttime, when the wind died. Schools required children to raise hands, not voices. One merchant even offered discounts for silent customers. Was it precaution, habit, or something older? The town couldn't say, because at this point they no longer remembered life before the silence. It wasn't trauma anymore. It was identity. The parish with no choir before the illness, Almissa had a famous local choir, known for sea shanties and call and response psalms. But in the years after the sickness, the choir